In May 1968, France was in chaos. Student protests had brought Paris to a standstill, factories were shut down, and nearly 10 million workers were on strike for weeks. It appeared as though the government of Charles de Gaulle might collapse under the pressure. Yet inside the Élysée Palace, one man was not focused on the unrest in the streets. Instead, he was deeply absorbed in documents, highly sensitive reports, and intelligence gathered over decades at the heart of French power. He reviewed them carefully, employing trusted individuals to handle the material. Then, rather than storing the documents in a government archive or destroying them, he entrusted them to a private intermediary outside the official state system. He gave strict instructions that the documents remain hidden and undisclosed. Eventually, de Gaulle's government survived the crisis, but the mysterious collection of files remained concealed for nearly 30 years. Even after the man's death in 1997, the archives stayed sealed. It was not until the early 2000s, more than a decade later, that French archivists finally gained access to them. What they discovered was extraordinary. The files had been intentionally disorganized, documents shuffled out of sequence, classified material mixed with ordinary correspondence, and contextual clues deliberately removed. Even in death, the man had ensured that his secrets would not be easily uncovered. The question remained, who was this man? And what role had he played that required such extreme secrecy? On February 17, 1964, in the Central African nation of Gabon, around 150 soldiers surrounded the presidential palace in Libreville. Inside, President Léon Mba understood exactly what was happening. Rather than resist, he was forced onto national radio and compelled to announce his own resignation. By sunrise, opposition leader Jean-Hilaire Obama had been declared provisional president. The soldiers celebrated what seemed to be a successful coup. But thousands of kilometers away in Paris, one man was already making calls that would change everything. His name was Jacques Foccart. Within 48 hours, he demonstrated a level of power that African leaders would never forget. Using secret defense agreements signed during independence, agreements few Gabonese citizens had ever seen, and even fewer outsiders fully understood, Foccart mobilized French paratroopers stationed in Senegal and Congo-Brazzaville. By February 19th, only 2 days later, around 600 French troops had arrived in Libreville. The coup leaders were arrested, some were killed, and President Maba was restored to power under French military protection. Obama, who had briefly served as president for only 2 days, was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. What makes the story remarkable is that Jacques Foccart was not the president of France. He was not a military general or even a cabinet minister. Officially, he was merely an advisor, a bureaucrat holding the title of Secretary General for African and Malagasy Affairs. So, how did a man with such an ordinary title manage to deploy paratroopers across an ocean in less than 2 days? How did he possess the authority to overturn a coup in a sovereign nation? Jacques Foccart is not a name most people recognize today. He was never elected president, never commanded armies publicly, and rarely appeared at the center of official history books. Yet for decades, his presence seemed to linger behind some of the most consequential and controversial political events in post-colonial Africa. Again and again, his name surfaced around coups, assassinations, intelligence operations, and sudden shifts in power across the continent. To understand why, you first have to understand the world that created him, and the crisis France faced as its empire began to collapse. Foccart was born in 1913 in western France, into a family already tied to the French colonial system. His relatives had commercial interests in Guadeloupe, part of France's overseas empire, and from a young age he was exposed to the realities of imperial power. Empire was not simply about flags planted on distant soil or maps colored in French blue. It was about networks of money, labor, loyalty, and extraction. Long before he entered politics, Foccart had already seen how influence could travel quietly through business interests, political relationships, and personal connections. These early experiences would shape the way he later viewed Africa, not as a collection of sovereign nations, but as a strategic system that France could continue to manage even after formal colonial rule disappeared. The defining turning point in his life came during World War II. When Nazi Germany occupied France, Foccart joined the French resistance. But unlike many resistance fighters who became symbols of battlefield heroism, his work unfolded in the shadows. He specialized in intelligence gathering, covert coordination, secret communications, and underground logistics. He learned how clandestine systems operated, how information could move invisibly across borders, and how influence often depended less on public authority than on hidden relationships. The war taught him that real power frequently exists behind the scenes, exercised by people the public rarely notices. Those lessons would become the foundation of his later career. By 1958, France itself was in crisis. The Algerian War had destabilized the country politically and morally, pushing the collapsing Fourth Republic to the brink. In the middle of this chaos, Charles de Gaulle returned to power as the man expected to restore order. But de Gaulle inherited a problem far larger than Algeria alone. France still controlled a vast colonial empire stretching across West and Central Africa. At the same time, the global age of empire was clearly ending. Anti-colonial movements were growing stronger. Independence demands were becoming impossible to suppress, and maintaining direct colonial rule through military force was becoming economically and politically unsustainable. Yet de Gaulle understood something critical. France still depended heavily on Africa. African uranium was essential to France's emerging nuclear ambitions. Oil, raw materials, and agricultural products flowing from the continent remained economically valuable. French industries also depended on African markets for exports. Beyond economics, Africa held immense geopolitical importance during the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were competing aggressively for influence across newly independent nations. Losing Africa entirely could mean losing France's status as a global power. This created a dilemma that would define French policy for decades. If France could no longer maintain its empire openly, how could it preserve influence without formal colonial control? In other words, how do you keep an empire after empire itself becomes politically unacceptable? The answer, in many ways, became Jacques Foccart. De Gaulle appointed him Secretary General for African and Malagasy Affairs, a title that sounded administrative and harmless enough to avoid public scrutiny. In reality, Foccart became the architect of France's African strategy. He reported directly to the president and enjoyed an extraordinary level of personal access that few officials ever received. The two men reportedly met constantly to discuss African affairs, often privately. No other region received such concentrated attention from the French presidency. Over time, de Gaulle gave Foccart a nickname that captured his growing reputation, Monsieur Afrique, Mr. Africa. Under Foccart, France developed what critics later described as a shadow system of post-colonial influence. Officially, African colonies gained independence. Flags changed. National anthems replaced colonial symbols. But beneath the surface, many of the old structures remained intact. French military advisors stayed embedded in local governments. French intelligence networks continued operating across the continent. Economic systems remained closely tied to Paris through trade agreements and currency arrangements. Political elites often depended on French support to maintain power. Independence existed, but it was frequently constrained by invisible networks of dependency and influence. And whenever a leader threatened to break away from that system, violence often followed. One of the clearest examples was Félix Roland Moumié, the leader of the UPC in Cameroon. Moumié demanded genuine independence, not symbolic independence controlled indirectly from Paris. Even after Cameroon formally became independent, he continued organizing resistance from exile in Guinea. He spoke internationally, built alliances abroad, and became an increasingly powerful symbol of anti-colonial resistance. To French officials fighting a brutal counterinsurgency war in Cameroon, Moumié represented a growing threat. In October 1960, Moumié met a man in Geneva who introduced himself as a journalist sympathetic to African liberation causes. During their meeting, Moumié consumed a drink secretly laced with thallium, a slow-acting poison that was difficult to detect. Soon afterward, his health deteriorated rapidly. Before losing consciousness, he reportedly told doctors that something had tasted strange in his drink. Swiss investigators later confirmed poisoning and uncovered links pointing toward French intelligence operatives. Yet, despite the evidence, the case quietly disappeared. There was no trial, no conviction, and no serious diplomatic fallout. Moumier died at only 35 years old. Then, only a few years later, another African leader challenged French influence and met a similarly violent end. Sylvanus Olympio had led Togo to independence and sought to build genuine sovereignty for his country. He resisted French economic dominance and explored creating a national currency independent from the French-controlled financial system. Most dangerously, he refused to integrate large numbers of former colonial troops into Togo's military. These soldiers had been trained and financed by France and remained deeply connected to French military structures. In January 1963, soldiers attacked Olympio's residence during the night. He fled barefoot toward the nearby American embassy, hoping to find protection. He was intercepted and shot before reaching safety. Officially, the killing was portrayed as a spontaneous mutiny by dissatisfied soldiers. But the broader context suggested something more complicated. French-trained forces had overthrown a leader attempting to reduce French influence, and the government that replaced him proved far more cooperative with Paris. One of the men associated with the coup, Gnassingbé Eyadema, would later rule Togo for decades with continued French support. This is what made Jacques Foccart such a controversial figure. It was rarely possible to prove direct responsibility for every operation, assassination, or coup. Much of the system functioned precisely because it operated through deniability, intermediaries, and hidden channels. But over time, a pattern became increasingly difficult to ignore. Leaders who threatened French interests often found themselves destabilized, removed, or isolated. Governments favorable to Paris received military assistance, diplomatic backing, and economic support. France no longer ruled Africa through formal colonial administration. Instead, it exercised influence through intelligence networks, economic dependency, military relationships, and political engineering hidden beneath the surface of official independence. In many ways, Foccart represented the transformation of empire itself. Colonialism did not simply disappear after independence. It evolved. The methods became quieter, more sophisticated, and harder to see. Rather than direct conquest, power flowed through covert operations, strategic alliances, financial systems, and carefully managed political networks. And standing at the center of much of that system, invisible to most of the world but deeply feared by those who understood it, was Jacques Foccart, the man who helped France learn how to keep an empire without officially calling it one anymore. Whenever journalists tried to corner Jacques Foccart about the coup, assassinations, and covert operations surrounding France's role in Africa, his response was almost always the same: calm, controlled, deliberately vague. The answer is in the archives. It sounded dismissive at first, almost evasive. But hidden inside that answer was something revealing. Foccart understood that the real history of French power in Africa existed behind closed doors, buried in classified files, intelligence reports, and private presidential conversations the public would not see for decades. And by the time reporters were asking those questions, the system itself was already deeply entrenched. By the mid-1960s, France had accomplished something extraordinary and deeply controversial. It had managed to preserve enormous influence over formerly independent African states without needing to maintain direct colonial rule. This was no longer empire in the traditional sense. French governors were gone. Colonial flags had come down. Independence ceremonies had already happened. But underneath those visible changes, another structure had quietly taken shape, a hidden architecture of control. Scholars would later describe it as a neo-colonial system, a network of military agreements, financial dependency, intelligence operations, and political relationships designed to ensure that French influence survived the collapse of formal empire. And each part of that system reinforced the others. The first pillar was military power. France signed defense agreements with many newly independent African states shortly after independence. Officially, these agreements were framed as partnerships between sovereign nations, mutual security arrangements meant to provide stability and protection. But in practice, they gave France extraordinary freedom to intervene militarily across the continent whenever French interests appeared threatened. The language was always diplomatic, restoring order, supporting allies, preventing instability. But behind those justifications was a much broader reality. These agreements effectively gave France legal cover to insert troops, influence political outcomes, and shape internal crises inside nations that were supposedly independent. African presidents understood the implication immediately. Remaining aligned with Paris often meant protection. Drifting too far away could mean isolation, or worse. And once France demonstrated that this model worked, it became a blueprint. The empire had not disappeared. It had simply become harder to see. The second pillar was money, more specifically, currency. Even today, 14 African countries continue using the CFA franc, a monetary system originally created by France during the colonial era in the 1940s. Though the name evolved after independence, the underlying structure remained remarkably intact. At first glance, the system appeared stable. The CFA franc was pegged at a fixed rate first to the French franc and later to the euro, with France guaranteeing convertibility. Supporters argued this created financial predictability and reduced inflation. But critics saw something else, because countries using the CFA franc were required to place a significant portion of their foreign exchange reserves with the French treasury. Monetary decisions could not be made entirely independently. Currency adjustments, devaluations, and broader financial policy remained tied to structures outside African control. And Faucart understood the importance of this perfectly, because controlling money often means controlling political survival. A government unable to stabilize its currency struggles to pay soldiers, civil servants, or public institutions. And in fragile post-colonial states, a president who cannot reliably pay the military rarely remains president for very long. Jacques Faucart wasn't simply managing alliances in Africa, he was managing dependency. His system kept governments financially and militarily stable while ensuring they remained tied to France. And at the center of that system was one critical principle: plausible deniability. When coups happened, leaders disappeared, or covert operations unfolded, France rarely appeared directly involved. If operations succeeded, French influence expanded. If they failed or became public, responsibility vanished into confusion. Operatives acted independently. Officials denied knowledge. Evidence disappeared. Power operated through ambiguity. Few cases expose this more clearly than the disappearance of Mehdi Ben Barka. Ben Barka was one of the leading anti-imperialist voices of the 1960s, helping organize the Tricontinental Conference to unite liberation movements across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. On October 29, 1965, French police officers approached him in Paris and escorted him into an unmarked car. He was never seen again. Investigations later uncovered connections involving Moroccan intelligence, French intermediaries, criminal networks, and possible state involvement. Witnesses contradicted one another. Evidence vanished, and Ben Barka's body was never found. By then, another truth had become clear. Faucart rarely needed to act directly. His system relied on intermediaries, proxies, and unofficial actors operating between politics, intelligence, and violence. No figure represented that world more than Bob Denard. Denard became one of the 20th century's most infamous mercenaries, moving from coup to coup across Africa. He trained armed groups, overthrew governments, and repeatedly claimed many of his missions had the silent approval of figures inside the French state, especially Faucart. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Comoros. In 1978, Denard helped overthrow President Ali Soili after Soili distanced himself from France. Soon afterward, Soili reportedly died while trying to escape. But Denard didn't leave. He stayed for years, controlled the presidential guard, and became the real power behind the state. France maintained strategic influence without direct responsibility, while local elites and foreign allies benefited from the arrangement. It was influence without accountability. But some African leaders could not be absorbed into this system. They represented an alternative. And perhaps none frightened the system more than Thomas Sankara. After taking power in 1983, Sankara renamed Upper Volta as Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. He rejected elite privilege, reduced government salaries, expanded vaccination and literacy campaigns, and openly criticized the IMF, World Bank, and African dependency on former colonial powers. "He who feeds you, controls you," he warned. That message made him dangerous. Even after Foucault officially left office, the networks he built remained active, and many of France's closest African allies viewed Sankara as a threat. Then, on October 15, 1987, Sankara entered a meeting in Ouagadougou. He never came out alive. The coup was led by his former ally, Blaise Compaoré. Sankara was killed at 37 years old, and many of his reforms were quickly reversed. Burkina Faso re-entered the same international political and economic system Sankara had tried to escape. By the 1990s, Foucault himself was old and largely removed from politics, but the system he created remained alive, and soon it would cast, perhaps, its darkest shadow. In the early 1990s, France strongly supported the government of Juvenal Habyarimana in Rwanda through military aid, intelligence cooperation, and diplomatic backing. Then came the 1994 genocide. Over roughly 100 days, around 800,000 Tutsi civilians and moderate Hutus were murdered. Near the end of the killings, France launched Operation Turquoise, officially a humanitarian mission. It saved lives, but critics argued it also allowed many perpetrators to escape into neighboring Democratic Republic of the Congo. For decades, France denied responsibility. But in 2021, an inquiry commissioned by Emmanuel Macron concluded that France carried serious and overwhelming responsibilities through its continued support for the Rwandan regime, even as warnings of mass violence mounted. The report did not accuse France of carrying out the genocide itself, but it reached a devastating conclusion. The habits, loyalties, and assumptions built through the Françafrique system helped make the catastrophe possible. And then came the archives. When historians finally gained access to some of Foucault's long-hidden files, they found evidence of covert pressure campaigns, intelligence operations, and material linked to cases like Mehdi Ben Barka's disappearance. The documents confirmed what many had suspected for years. Françafrique was real, a hidden system of political, military, and economic influence operating beneath the surface of African independence. And even today, parts of that system remain. The CFA franc still exists. French military agreements still shape regional security. French companies remain deeply embedded across parts of Africa. But something is changing. In recent years, countries like Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso have openly challenged French influence, with military governments ordering French troops to leave and crowds celebrating their departure. Many of the people protesting today never lived under colonial rule itself. What they are rejecting is the system that survived after empire officially ended, because Jacques Faucard's true achievement was not preserving colonialism openly. It was redesigning empire for a post-colonial world.